The Spinosaurus, A Tale of Humans and Dinosaurs, or The Founding and Early History of the New United Coalition by Peyton Strange. How it happened, no one knew, and yet it didn't matter. Somehow, the dinosaurs had reappeared. Somehow, they had simply returned, born again from an unseen anomaly that couldn't be explained by science. And it wasn't just dinosaurs. It was every form of extinct life, prehistoric or modern, plants as well as animals. As the anomaly spread like a virus, human civilization was slowly overwhelmed, and it collapsed. The natural order of things was then thrown into chaos as a free-for-all for survival between all species began. Dinosaurs suddenly hunted unprepared modern mammals. Prehistoric trees the size of weeds tried to compete with massive redwoods that blocked much of the sun from reaching the ground. And humans faced an apocalypse on a scale unlike anything their species had seen since the Ice Age, if such a comparison was even fair. Some species that had been extinct once reappeared and vanished back into extinction again, along with some modern-day species that could not survive in such a world. What was left was a mix of all life forms that had ever lived on the planet. Ancient and modern animals now lived side by side. The Earth had witnessed its sixth mass extinction event, though it was unlike anything that anyone had predicted. It wasn't the climate, it wasn't pollution, it wasn't overhunting, it was simply an unexplainable anomaly. This story begins just before this unstable period, and then follows what happened next. In a world overrun with dinosaurs, can humanity survive with them and itself, or are we doomed to extinction by the claws of the previously extinct? So far, we have managed it. We clawed our way back from the brink of extinction. That chaos was all some 300 years ago now. This account is a combined compilation of various historical texts and accounts from the time, written or recorded by those who were there. Oftentimes, these documents give us key details of how events and battles played out, or what some of the people who lived then, and who we now remember as near mythical heroes who forged our coalition's early history back in those dark, volatile years after the old world fell, did that influenced where we are as a society today. These scattered texts, personal records, journals, first-hand accounts, occasionally the mindless, rambling scribbles of someone, or their detailed records, have been collected and edited together into a narrative in an effort to present the early history of our reestablished civilization. Due to the loss of some records and the deaths of those who were there, certain speculations are made based on the context of other events to reconstruct these moments that weren't recorded as they might have happened. No speculation was made without having some source which suggested or implied the event occurred, unless it was within reason given the context of the events playing out around it. Thankfully, this proved a rare necessity. In later life, many of those who we will follow in this work sat down and recorded their stories and added many of the small details that otherwise would have been forgotten. It has allowed us to reconstruct a vivid and true-to-life image for you all, as if you had stepped back into those years. For the first time, collected in one place, this is what happened when the world our ancestors knew ended. This historical account will begin with the journal of Nick Edwards. This all began on the unassuming day that I found an egg in the forest while out on a hike. It was just sitting on an old rotting log, alone, and almost seemed to have simply materialized there. During the following days, I tried to find out what had laid the egg, but after a few days of research, the only thing I found was that there was nothing anywhere in western Ohio, or all of Ohio, that laid eggs as big as the one I'd found. Not even eagles laid eggs that big. After checking in on it for several more days and seeing no change around it at all, I decided that it was abandoned, and I took it home. I was simply too curious at that point to just forget about the whole thing. I wanted to see what would hatch from it. When it did hatch, not a very long time afterward at all, it turned out there was a reason the whole thing seemed so strange. What hatched out of that egg was a real baby dinosaur. Specifically, the hatchling was a Spinosaurus. A Spinosaurus aegypticus, if you want to be specific. I realized that before the end of the world as we once knew it happened, that this news I'm delivering would have been earth-shattering. Guess I'm just used to him and dinosaurs as a whole now. Like, everyone else who is still alive in this post-apocalyptic world of chaos that we all live in now. I named him, the hatchling, Spino. I know, I'm very creative with names. He became my best friend. I raised him, and he spent his first year living in my house, but when he grew too big, he had to move outside. From then on, he lived in the woods just behind my house, though this almost didn't happen at all. Now, don't think that my first thought was to raise the little prehistoric carnivore as if it was a puppy. When I first realized what had hatched from the egg, I panicked. Personally, I think that was a reasonable reaction to seeing a living dinosaur. I didn't want any part of keeping and raising a dinosaur or any part in whatever voodoo was going on, and had gone to my garage to get my hatchet intending on killing the dinosaur before it grew big enough to eat me. Then I was going to bury my head in the sand and forget this ever happened. But when I had got back to my living room, where he had hatched, I saw the baby looking up at me with large eyes radiating nothing but trust, love, and curiosity. That look, that adorable little look, was enough to make me stop. Sounds rather cliche, but it's true, and from that day on, I was suddenly a father. I still feel like an ass, though, whenever I think about what I almost did. When Spino had grown into a full adult, I did tell him about it. He didn't take it well, but understood my reaction after thinking about it from my point of view, and after a tense week, we kept our distance from each other. We both made peace with the fact of what I'd nearly done. Yes, he understood me when I told him. I found out very quickly that he was not exactly what you'd think of as a normal dinosaur. He was an enigma within a situation that was already an enigma, and I'll explain why once I add a little more context about my life and my life with him. When I was home from university and when I wasn't studying for my degree in advanced animal biology, I would spend all my time with Spino. Being an introvert ever since an early age, I found socializing with a dinosaur who doesn't judge me much easier than spending my time hanging out with humans that do. It was like how your beloved dog never judged you, though in my situation, the beloved sidekick could understand me. And dinosaur or not, Spino was perfectly safe to be around. You see, Spino wasn't what you would call a normal dinosaur, not even a normal member of his respective species. Hell, he wasn't even normal for his entire genus. Aside from the whole being around in our modern age thing, he didn't have the eel-like tail that we know Spinosaurus had, and he was bigger than any known Spinosaurus fossils were. He walked upright on his powerful hind legs most of the time, but was also perfectly comfortable dropping down and walking on all fours. In addition, he seemed to have a much stronger bite force than a Spinosaurus was thought to have had. Also, the big guy was smart. He was intelligent. Now, since I want this to be a full record of where things started and where they are now, I'll go into a little further detail about him and then the events that followed his birth. He could talk. As you know, based on what we all saw when civilization collapsed, there were rare exceptions of reborn prehistoric life that, for reasons we still don't know, could talk. They also had the same imaginative, high-powered brains as people do, or maybe a more proper way to describe it would be they had ones on the same level as humans. Spino happened to be one of those rare examples. And this was not limited to dinosaurs. Every animal species that had ever lived just came back. And I would guess there were talking ones in each species. Doesn't the idea of a talking orthicone sound wild? Not to mention about as alien and unnatural that something could be? I bet there is one out there in the ocean somewhere. Why wouldn't sea creatures be affected the same way dinosaurs like Spino were? Spino lived in my house for about the first year of his life. Despite college taking up much of my time, I was still able to raise him. Since I lived alone in the country, in a house located in a large forest that I think was state-owned land before the apocalypse, with no neighbors, the back acreage behind my house was all that was around me for miles. So, the company Spino provided me was genuinely nice, and some of my favorite memories were from that point in time. I remember the first time Spino heard thunder. He'd practically torn the blankets on my bed apart as he tried to bury himself under the covers next to me. It couldn't have been more of an opposite to the time I first let him swim in the pool on my back deck. It was one of those nice underground pools, and he zipped around under the water for hours. he had no interest in sitting with me at all that entire day. I had to put a leash on him to get him to come back inside after it started getting dark. The scratch marks he left in the deck wood never did fully go away. I remember another time, I think Spino was around 4 months old and about the size of a chocolate lab, when he jumped up onto my kitchen island where I was sitting and begged me to let him try my coffee. After a few seconds of begging, he must have decided that I was taking too long to answer because he just stuck his snout right into my mug and took a big, slobbery drink. He made a huge mess. Though, let me just say, a hyper baby Spinosaurus getting a caffeine high was one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. He really was my best friend, and the only living thing that had ever been in my life that I'd give the honor of calling family to. So, putting the hatchet back where I grabbed it from on the day that he hatched was the best thing I'd ever done. After remembering all of this, I'm gonna have to go give him a treat now just to show him how much I appreciate him. He loves a good chin scratch and almost acts like a giant dog, a giant talking murderous dog with a sail on its back when I give him a treat. Not a characteristic you might expect from such a large dinosaur, but it's strangely adorable. On top of that, Spino had, and still does have, a very openly blunt personality. If he wants to say something, then he will, no matter what your opinions of his statement might be. Once he had grown too big and had to move out of my house and into the forest, at about a year old, I'd visit him every day. We loved spending time together out there, especially when we'd explore far and wide. I have many more fun memories from that time, finding all manner of interesting things deep in those woods. You could find waterfalls, abandoned buildings, old wells, large, secluded ponds, caves, and all sorts of interesting things in those hills and trees. Living where I did meant that keeping his existence under the world's radar was relatively easy, not that he had a desire for the world to know about him. But now that you have an idea of who I am and who Spino, my large, bluntly speaking, fun-loving adopted dinosaur son is, I'll start talking about how things went wrong. First, I do want to add that one other activity we both enjoy is stargazing. Spino didn't, and still doesn't, fully understand what a galaxy is, but that doesn't bother him. All he's ever cared about was that the night sky is beautiful, and the nights that it's fully visible are his favorite period to be awake. On nights like this, especially back when he was younger, he would just look at it for hours. I'd always point out various stars, planets, and galaxies and tell him what they were specifically. Spino's eyes, while stargazing with me, were always so bright. They twinkled with curiosity. Spino has always liked to search out galaxies in the night sky, like the Milky Way, Andromeda, more distant neighbors, or nearby orbiting dwarf galaxies. His gaze would eventually then wander to things much closer to home, like the moon, or the local neighboring planets that we share the solar system with. To him, it didn't matter. They all fascinate him. Me, I always end up trying to spot Jupiter, mostly because its moon Europa is what always deeply fascinated me, what made my mind wander. Although, with how things are in the world now, sadly I'll never live to learn if life is there. As a kid, I dreamed about being the first human to step foot on that frozen moon and finding what alien life swam in its hidden ocean, but it's likely no one will ever leave this planet again. Humanity was born here, and we'll all die here as well, like everything before us. It's rather a poetic truth. As a kid, I, too, had similar bright eyes when stargazing that Spino has now when he looks up into the deep void of space. I might still have that sparkle today, too, who knows. This was simply a quick added note, but I felt it was worth mentioning, and I'd forgotten to add it before. My next entry will pick up at the point that things started to fall apart, though I personally wouldn't see things crumbling apart in my area until months later. It was a little over 2 years after Spino hatched that I first started seeing the signs that something was not right. The apocalypse really had a slow burn, building up over a few years before the fuse that destroyed civilization over a few months was ignited. Dinosaurs and other extinct animals from every point of Earth's history went from extinct to rare to overwhelming human civilization and sent the world into unstable anarchy. I have a lot to cover, so in all probability my journal will span multiple entries. Since I'm only recording key events, I'm going to try to keep it short and just hit the main points, which still leaves much to tell. The morning the anarchy had started began perfectly normal. I'd just finished my morning coffee, listened to an updated report about a new serial killer operating along the Ohio River, and had just stepped out of my house onto the back porch near my pool, only to be snatched up in one of Spino's large claw-adorned hands. He'd been waiting just outside my door. His demeanor was odd, and he didn't respond to my questions, so I just let him carry me wherever he was going. I mean, can you argue with a Spinosaurus if it wants to take you somewhere? Another thing I noticed at the time that caused me to just let it happen was his body language. It was strangely urgent in a way I hadn't seen before. It was primal. Maybe? I can't really think of a word that fits the state I saw him in perfectly, but primal comes close. Eventually, after he carried me a fair way off into the forest, he sat me down, and I saw what was affecting him. Let me interrupt here for a moment, because I want to add that this record might be inaccurate in a few spots. I'm writing all of this from memory, and it's been roughly a year since the main events I'm writing came to their conclusion, and even longer since the events I'm reviewing now occurred. Yes, I realize I had forgotten to mention that. Suppose I didn't think the information was needed at the time. I'll try to keep any further interruption to a minimum. Again, I want this to be as clear, as comprehensive, and as complete as possible. Going off memory, here is what happened next, as well as what happened over the next few months. And remember what I already said, I'm only focusing on the big events for the most part. So, what was it that had affected Spino so much? A set of dinosaur tracks. A set of tracks he hadn't left behind, and they were big too. I was hunting here last night, Spino had explained to me as I examined them, and found this trail. I tracked it here, but it crossed the stream and I lost the scent. I remember that when I looked on the other side of the stream, the forest was much denser and looked rather foreboding. We decided to cross and explore. Another dinosaur being in the area was something that needed investigating. As I said before, I was able to keep Spino, who at this point I thought was the only one there'd be, a secret from the world easily enough because I didn't want to risk him being exploited by opportunists. I did not want to deal with the red tape that would inevitably come from such a revelation. Nor did I feel confident people could manage the wide revelation of a dinosaur being alive, but would a second dinosaur cooperate with that agreement? That kind of relationship? Was it even really my responsibility at all? Did it even matter? Spino willingly went along with being kept a secret. Again, he had no desire to go anywhere that wasn't with me, nor did he want to be subjected to the kind of attention he'd receive were he revealed. If another dinosaur was suddenly in our world as well, then surely it was inevitable that people would find out about it and exploit it, whether it cared that they did or not. Those are my questions and concerns, among many others. Before we could answer, or work to resolve any of them, we had to find it, whatever the new arrival was. Upstream, the water was shallow and fast-flowing, but in the spot where we stood, it was much deeper, so I had to climb up onto Spino's back, and he then waded across. Once we got to the opposite bank, I then jumped off Spino and moved to the tree line, telling him I'd look ahead and he could catch up once he was able to push through the tightly packed trees. I vividly remember Spino not liking the idea, but I went on ahead anyway. Though I do admit I was nervous about pushing ahead alone, but my curiosity got the best of me in the moment. After shoving my way through the trees, I realized what a bad move I had made. It just embarrasses me as to how blind to danger I was way back then. The apocalypse that would come in the following months really opened my eyes to that. I'd found myself in a clearing encircled by a large ring of trees, and sleeping in the center of it was, as expected from the tracks it left, another dinosaur. Now at the time, that was earth-shattering, tracks or not. Little did I know that finding the dinosaur was just a precursor to what would come in the next months. The dinosaur in question was a large, thinly feathered Tyrannosaurus rex. Without a doubt, seeing that creature was the single biggest oh shit moment I've ever had in my life. It seemed impossible, an odd feeling because I saw a living dinosaur every day, that I was looking at an actual Tyrannosaurus. That dinosaur was something that a human should not have been able to behold, a fearsome force of brutal power and strength unlike any other that had ever lived, a force from which humans were supposed to be safely separated from by over 60 million years. It was such a different feeling than seeing Spino, and I struggle to put it into exact words. If you've seen one, you know what I mean. The dinosaur was a huge, fully grown adult bull. I knew enough about Tyrannosaurus to tell that it was definitely a fully grown specimen based on the size, but it was also not big enough to be a female. My less than silent entry into the clearing had awakened it. Its eyes were gazing right at me. I remember that predatory look with searing accuracy. They were the type of eyes you see on the monsters in your nightmares. There was no deeper emotion or thought like with Spino. There was just hungry instinct behind those pupils. Those menacing eyes are burned into my brain and are forever in my nightmares. The T-Rex stood up, realizing easy prey was in the clearing, and emitted a deep roaring noise. It was a giant hungry dinosaur, and I'd walked right up to it. I might as well have rung the dinner bell, rubbed seasoning all over myself, and laid down on a silver platter for it. As the Tyrannosaur stalked towards me, I confirmed what its eyes had told me already. This one definitely could not talk. You might ask why I didn't run at that point. Well, you see, when someone is in a situation like I was, their brain chooses either flight or fight, but it can get stuck between them, and when it does, you just freeze up. That's what happened to me. I froze on the spot, and just as I was about to be breakfast for a Tyrannosaur, the trees to my left were suddenly smashed by another large form, Spino. He pulled himself into the clearing, shoving past the last trees, then reared up tall on his hind legs and roared. The Rex turned to face him and deeply vocalized in response, stalking towards Spino with powerful confidence. The Rex charged without pause towards the new threat, and there the standoff ended. I watched Spino drop back onto all fours with a thunderous boom, then dodge to the side, avoiding the Rex's first attack. In return, he had swiped at its head with his arms, and one of his swipes struck the Rex's left eye. The T-Rex bellowed again as its eye was gouged out of its skull in a gory mess, shaking its head in response to the pain, and Spino went for its throat. What Spino was trying to do was blind the Rex so it couldn't stop his following attacks or make use of its powerful jaws. The Rex saw Spino coming with its remaining eye and dodged his bite, and instead, it was the one to bite into Spino's neck. Spino kept his footing and slashed its other eye out with those large claws growing out of the tips of his fingers and tore himself free from the bite, though not without receiving some deep, bloody puncture wounds from the Rex's teeth. I remember just standing still, frozen between fight and flight, as I'd watched Spino, as he then dropped onto all fours again and jumped upwards with a powerful lunge from his legs, biting the Rex's neck from below. He pushed up and kept pushing until the Rex stumbled, and the motion of it falling, combined with how Spino was holding it, caused its neck to audibly snap. Spino opened his jaws, and the limp corpse dropped dead onto the ground, with another thunderous boom. That thundering crash that it made upon hitting the ground was something you must hear with your own ears to understand. I could never describe it accurately with words, exactly like I couldn't describe the feeling of seeing a Tyrannosaurus. I can only say the force was so physically vivid, and its power so overwhelming, that I stumbled a little bit as the ground shook as shockwaves blasted through it. Then there was the silence, and I remember it just as vividly as the boom. Not even a stray summer songbird was singing away in the surrounding trees. It was like the modern animals couldn't understand what show they'd just been witness to. A bear might have been the largest animal the birds and deer around here had ever seen, not these towering behemoths from well over 60 million years in the past. After the fight was done and I regained my footing, I unfroze at last and quickly ran over to Spino and made sure he was okay. Thankfully, he was just fine. He let me check his wounds, and none were life-threatening, so we then turned our attention to the Rex and examined it. Its teeth remained in a snarl, and its eyes were blank and glassy. After several minutes of Taking in the impossible, I had looked at Spino and asked, "How is it here?" And Spino's reply had simply been, "I don't know." What we learned that day was that Spino was not the only dinosaur reborn from extinction. Another dinosaur had reappeared. What had been an incredible and fun mystery had now turned ominous. Two anomalies like this were enough to turn them from intriguing yet harmless to concerning. Spino told me we shouldn't let it worry us just yet, to which I had reluctantly agreed, and so we just went back home, confused, but alive. Things didn't get any better over the next few months. Assessing the situation now, I can say that the fall of civilization occurred mostly over the northern hemisphere's winter months, the collapse spreading eastward from the west coast here in the United States, though I didn't truly see any of it happen living in the isolated area I was at the time. I remember one of the earliest things I did see on the wider scale of things was a video that blew up on the internet after being uploaded. It showed a whale-watching ship called the Summer Air, full of eager tourists, suddenly be crushed and sunk when a thalattorchion, a giant species of aquatic marine reptile that had been the dominant predator of the mid-Triassic era oceans, leapt from the water and down onto the boat. As horrible as it was, I couldn't help but think that it would have been at least a little ironic if it had been a Basilosaurus that had done the deed instead. You know, because it's technically a whale. Dark humor must help with coping, especially in situations where you couldn't understand what the hell was happening. It had helped me anyway. Another video I saw around that time, shortly before winter, was a video someone had taken while hiking in a national park. The video showed a pterodactyl fly over the people who were hiking, paying them no mind as it passed over them and continued flying on to wherever it was going. Though, of course, the video was very low quality and heavily pixelated, as videos like that always tended to be. You know what it was like at the time? The best way I can describe it is that it was like the Earth wanted humans gone and her prehistoric life back again. If I was the Earth, I couldn't say I wouldn't wish the same. This incident was one of the worst of those early months. It was around midnight when something within myself made me wake up. Some sixth sense had picked up on that something was amiss. The house was dark. I never slept with lights on at all. I'd never even done that as a kid, and I just had a feeling of danger being nearby. It was too quiet, even for a house in the middle of the night. I just knew that something was off. I left my bed and walked into the hall, hearing nothing but the sound of distant thunder. Occasional flashes of lightning through the windows were my only source of light. Wincing every time the floorboard creaked, I went down the hall and entered the kitchen, slowly though, poking my head around the corner first before stepping in fully. Silence was almost overpowering, but the sound of something moving made me stop. In the center of my kitchen was the island countertop, and with a flash of lightning, I saw that the kitchen window on the other side was busted and lay scattered on the floor. I still don't know how I didn't hear that because I've never been a deep sleeper. I also saw that just poking out from the other side of the island was a mangled, bloody, dead raccoon. I'd only just seen it when it was violently yanked back behind the counter, and I then heard chewing, bones snapping, and swallowing. Wide-eyed, I'd silently threw myself to the floor and ducked behind my side of the island. I heard something large stand up, still chewing, its claws ticking on the floor as it moved. I heard sniffing coming around to my side of the island, and I slid along the floor to stay on the opposite side of whatever the thing in my house was. The sniffing stopped, and I clearly heard it chittering softly. The sound is still as clear in my mind today as it was on that night. Then, there was just silence. Until I heard the countertop creak a little as a massive weight was applied to it. The thing had climbed up onto the island and was likely scanning the room. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room and cast a shadow on the wall. The lightning cast a clearly defined shadow on my wall, and I knew what had to be in my house as soon as I saw it. It was a Utah raptor. It had to be, because no other known raptor species, or any other species in the Dromaeosaur family, was so large. I heard claws tapping on the countertop as it sniffed the room. Risking a glance up, I saw it practically standing right above me, one of its large toe claws inches above my head, slightly wrapped around the top of the counter. If it would have happened to glance down right then, it would have seen me. Not wanting to breathe, I pressed back against the island, trying to think of what my next move would be. I had no way to fight a Utah raptor. If you've never seen one, I envy you, but if you have, you know just how big they are. The only thing I could do was try to get away and buy time until I thought of something. Well, it looked down before I could think of anything. It loudly chittered at me, cocking its head to the side like a bird would as it did, its muscles quivering in aggression, and I scrambled to my feet, taking off down the hallway I'd come from. I heard it land on the floor and begin to chase me. I knew I wouldn't make it to my bedroom, so I ducked out of the hallway and into the living room and threw myself behind the couch. I then listened as the dinosaur ran into the room and stopped in the doorway. It began sniffing to try to find me. I knew hiding where I was wouldn't work, but I didn't need it to. What I did need was for the dinosaur to leave the hall entranceway. When it moved close, I took my chance and sprang past it, practically between its feather-coated legs. I think it was startled and likely confused by my sudden movement, and it didn't chase me right away. In fact, I was back in the hallway running towards my bedroom before I heard it shriek and begin to follow me again. Those few seconds were what saved me, because the raptor had just gotten back into the hallway as I slammed my bedroom door shut. It banged into the door, scratched at it a few times, squawked, dare I say screamed, loudly, and then began to throw itself against the wood. I knew I only had a few seconds, so I went to the window and looked out. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so I didn't want to jump. As I was trying to decide what to do, the Utah raptor broke through my door and stalked inside the room, looking like the monster adults always promise their kids isn't under their beds. Even in the dark, I was able to see the outline of feathers, claws, and teeth just waiting inside my bedroom doorway. Not having a choice, I climbed out of the window and up onto the roof, feeling the wind created by the dinosaur's snapping jaws at my feet. The rain made the siding slick, but I was able to reach the gutter and climb onto the roof with difficulty. Unfortunately, the raptor followed me, jumping out of the window and latching onto the overhang as I had. It pulled itself up just as I'd rolled away from the edge. Soaked from the rain, I scampered across the roof and stood upright at the opposite end of it from the dinosaur. We were both soaked by the rain, and if anything, the raptor looked even more frightening with wet feathers drooping all along its body and arms. With every flash of lightning, I caught a glimpse of the raptor's gleaming teeth and those large, sickle toe claws I'd heard tapping on my counter. The raptor began to climb towards me on all fours, using the claws on its hands and feet to grip the roof and pull itself along. "Oh, come on," I remember saying as I looked around. Spotting my pool, though it was a bit far, I knew it was the only place I could go. The pool was just inside jumping distance if I backed up towards the raptor and sprinted before jumping. Which is what I did. Somehow, I avoided slipping and nearly ended up close enough for the raptor to swipe its claws at me too. Those claws dripping with water were close enough that I could have reached out and shaken its hand when I dashed to the edge. I landed in the pool on my back, causing a massive splash upon impact and knocking the wind out of myself. This stunned me for a moment, but I recovered after a short time and swam to the edge of the pool, where I climbed out quickly and then sprinted into the forest. I did not look back once. I just focused my attention on navigating through the forest and not on what was behind me. I found Spino quickly, woke him up, and told him what had just happened. He decided on the spot that from then on, he'd be sleeping just outside my house and not in the forest. I spent that night cold and wet in the forest, not getting another second of sleep. And first thing the following morning, Spino and I went back to my house. I watched from the tree line as he sniffed around my house until he finally told me that it was empty, and the Utah raptor was gone. We decided that same morning it would be best to search for the raptor. We searched for a full week, but never found anything. The raptor had vanished like a ghost. Thankfully, that was the last big thing to happen for a while, so this section of my journal will be a record of general events that occurred over a period of weeks, simply ones that I feel are worth mentioning for one reason or another. While we were searching for the Utah raptor, we'd come across another dinosaur species, a baryonyx. It was milling around a small waterfall and natural pool. Spino and I stayed away but watched it. A second baryonyx came out of the trees and added some sticks to what looked like nothing more than tangled up brush on the ground with white rocks inside. It took me a second to realize they were eggs, and the dinosaurs were making a nest. It was a mated pair, and they, and likely other dinosaurs as well, were reproducing. The implications of that were disconcerting. Summer turned to fall slowly as the months passed, and I kept up with the news about what had been happening. My university had long since put classes on indefinite suspension. The fall semester never even began. One day, as the leaves were just falling from the trees and forming a blanket on the ground, I had made a discovery with Spino while we were on our walk. It was a large shed skin, specifically a large shed snake skin, a Titanoboa skin. That was what made me first begin to look for things other than just dinosaurs roaming around. And it wasn't just carnivores roaming the earth again, despite what I'd personally seen. I'd seen videos of herbivores as well. I remember this one that went viral once uploaded. It showed a triceratops attacking and pushing a semi off the road in the Mojave Desert somewhere. In the background, you could clearly see the cars swerving this way and that to avoid falling victim to the raw prehistoric power of the raging dinosaur. The weather was first beginning to turn cold when I was personally witness to another in-person show of prehistoric power. Spino was at my side, but not a player in it like he'd been with the Tyrannosaur. We had been sitting on a riverbank out in the forest as the sun had begun to drop low in the sky, when a Stegosaurus had sauntered into view on the opposite bank from the left. It was just doing its thing, moseying on by without even a glance in our direction, when something else suddenly appeared and stalked towards it from the right. A Ceratosaurus, or horn-nose as Spino called it. They met and sized each other up for a moment before the carnivore had gone right for the Stegosaurus's neck. You always imagine what a fight between two dinosaurs might have been like. But seeing one from an impartial perspective, unlike with the Rex Spino fought, was impossible to describe. It was just two primal forces going at it, indifferent to you while you watched. It was better than any painting or movie ever showed. I'd saw something that was practically mythical come to life. I've seen a lot of things that seemed mythical come to life since all this started. The fight ended with the Stegosaurus stabbing the horn nose and its stomach several times with the spikes on its tail, which drove the Ceratosaurus away. Though the Stegosaurus did die shortly after, having received too many injuries to the neck. I thought it had survived, but when Spino and I had walked past the spot the next day, we saw that it was dead on the riverbank. The body was untouched. The Ceratosaurus never came back to feed on it, so it might have died too. I feel this story deserved its own section instead of being lumped in with the rest. It was my encounter with the Tyrannosaurus that, even though I never heard it speak, I know it could talk. I remember that my mind had been wandering that morning. I was already able to tell that the world was about to change. It was as if the planet had decided to go back in time millions of years. By the time this happened, winter had set in, and snow was covering the ground in a white blanket. That day, I needed time alone. My breaking point had been when I heard one too many terrible stories on the radio. The big report was that a safe zone in Italy, set up right outside the ruins of Pompeii, had been destroyed by the nearby volcano. I don't remember the name of the mountain because I was never good at that stuff. The volcano had suddenly and violently erupted, and the authorities sent in a team to save anyone they could, but all they found was that the safe zone had been completely buried by ash. It turned out to be one tragic story too many for my taste, and I told Spino how I felt. I told him I was going for a walk to clear my head, and he was hesitant about that after my earlier encounter. Yes, I was going alone despite the danger. Yes, I knew it was a stupid thing to do. Spino certainly wasn't thrilled when I told him that I was going to go for a short walk, but He agreed to let me go after a short argument. I don't remember how long I'd been walking through the snow-covered forest when it happened, but it might have been around 10 minutes or so into my walk when I heard brush moving nearby, and the sound caused me to stop. I turned and saw several black-feathered raptors, large ones at that, stick their heads up out of the snow and gaze at me with hungry eyes. It was like some horrible movie jump scare come to life. They'd just been sitting there, buried underneath the snow, I guess. This part is a bit of a fuzzy blur, but I remember turning and sprinting through the trees as fast as I was able in my restrictive winter clothing. I remember almost running or sliding into trees, narrowly missing them for several panicked moments, but then I ran into something immovable. A leg. I fell back onto my butt and looked up to meet the eyes of a Tyrannosaurus rex, the second one that I'd seen in person. It was brown in color, with gray feathers covering its body. It looked at me, growling softly, the same look in its eyes that Spino has, the same gleam of intelligence and higher thinking. That's how I knew it could talk. As its growling tapered off, it then also rumbled deeply, with its jaws now closed, and I felt the sound vibrate through my body. The raptors, which had been chasing me, must have felt the sound as well, because I heard them skidding through the snow to a collective stop behind me. Maybe they'd been just as oblivious to the presence of the silent T-Rex as I had been. The Rex then glanced up at the raptors for a moment, and then it turned its eyes back to me. It hissed and then, unexpectedly, motioned for me to leave. It motioned in the exact direction of my home. How did it know where I lived? I didn't ask. I just got to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I was too stunned and afraid to do anything but focus on getting home. Whatever the Rex did, it stopped the raptors from chasing me any further. I did make it home safely and told Spino what happened. Apparently that night, after I was asleep in bed, Spino went to the woods and found the Rex, and they had a long talk. I don't know what about. Spino has never told me. The worst night of those early months was by far the night I had a run-in with another talking prehistoric animal. And this one ate me. Yeah, you read that right. And it was just as bad as you can imagine it was. Here's what went down. As I remember it, by this point, man didn't rule Earth anymore. I mean, areas such as Washington, D.C. were still more or less functioning as they did pre-apocalypse. People were still doing their everyday jobs in most of the big East Coast cities, but the further west you went across the continent, the worse things became. Being from Western Ohio, I was living in the middle area between normalcy and chaos. The internet was still working where I lived, and I recall reading on it all the wild theories about what had caused everything to go wrong in the world. The wrath of God was one idea being thrown around. Others said the universe itself was glitching. Alien invasion was, of course, another theory people were adamant about. People also blamed the government, even the space agencies of all things, for the collapse of the world as we knew it. The conspiracy theories hit an all-time high for absurdity during that time. I can't say for certain about what all was claimed, though, because I stopped paying attention once people claimed that it was higher dimensional aliens causing our global predicament by manipulating time. It was still winter at that point, close to Christmas, or maybe it was already January. It was so hard to keep track, but snow still covered the ground, and I remember thinking it would never melt. I'd lost track of the dates because keeping them straight was not high on my list of priorities in those days. I rarely thought to even look when on my phone. My mind was elsewhere all the time. The blanket of snow on the ground was much thinner at this point, which was nice since running would be easier should I have to do so again. Spino and I decided to make the most of all the new things there were to see, to make the best of the cards we had been dealt. We'd often explore new areas of the forest to see what new creatures we could find. In all honesty, it was a nice distraction. I knew things were falling apart at the seams, but living so far in the country meant I was unaware that things were becoming worse than they seemed from a distance in every major city as civilization became overwhelmed by all the new threats. People simply could not manage the change in society and in the comforts they had become used to, and they packed up and left the cities. As they fled, the house of cards began to collapse around them. Roads were becoming jammed with cars, Roaming bands of people were joining together, and the supply chains were barely holding together. The food chains were on the brink of total collapse at this point too, and animals were starting to get as desperate as people. As desperate and dangerous. They were showing up in cities and towns a lot more often, but the talking variants seemed to go unnoticed for the most part. At that time, for Spino and I, the only thing that had changed was an increase in threats. For our trip that day, I rode on Spino's back because we didn't know what to expect. After a long while, we met no animals at all, not even a stray deer, and Spino decided it would be safe if I walked alongside him. We continued our exploring, and soon found ourselves standing on the top of a large hill. Far off in the valley below, we could see the remnants of a farm, obviously long abandoned. After some more walking, we arrived and looked around. I thought at that moment that no one had been there in at least 50 years. Thinking back, I realized it was probably more. The place was extremely dilapidated, especially the barn. Near the house, there was the rusted hulk of a 1940s truck that was little more than a frame at that point. Also, half buried in the snow, were the remains of various bits of rusted equipment scattered around the yard. There was also a frozen stream nearby, probably where those who lived there long ago got their water. We followed alongside the stream and it led to a frozen waterfall. It was there that I suddenly sensed a weird feeling. A feeling as if someone were watching us. Spino began to look around the forest, which appeared void of any living thing, so I reached over and tapped his leg. "You feel it too?" I asked him. He nodded, but his gaze didn't leave the surrounding trees. The only movement either of us saw was snow silently falling from the branches. We both quickly decided to walk back towards the barn, but that eerie sensation never left us. We went back up the hill and followed Spino's tracks back to our house, leaving the old farm behind. Evening was close by the time we returned to our home, the sky a gray-orange with dark silhouetted streaks that were long thin clouds. I said goodnight to Spino, and after eating a meal of flavorless noodles from a can, I went to bed. I woke later that same night because something felt off, sort of a deja vu moment. It was like the feeling I'd had the night the raptor was in the house. What I am about to share still makes me shudder when I think about it. When my body fully awoke, I realized that I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was next to it, lying on the floor, wrapped in the coils of a gigantic snake. I still have nightmares about this. Before I could scream, the snake tightened its coils around my body enough to stop my voice from escaping. "No, no, no. None of that," the snake hissed at me. The voice sounded like a mix between male and female. It was odd sounding. "It was hard following you in the cold, and harder still to sneak in here without your giant watchdog seeing me. But I did, and here is my prize," it hissed in my ear. "Let me go," I squeaked out. "Once he realizes what is going on, he'll just crash through the wall to get you," I told it, straining to breathe. My hand is shaking now as I remember the next part of the story. "Yes, but it will be too late to save you. Don't worry. I won't crush you with my coils. I like my prey to be wriggling when it hits my stomach," the Titanoboa hissed at me. Its voice was so sadistic and excited that it created cold fear inside me. So cold and scary that I still feel the same today when I remember it. I want to emphasize that this is getting very hard to write. This is not a memory I enjoy reliving. "No, not that," I begged the snake. "Oh yes, that," was all it said in response. Before opening its maw as wide as it would go, I heard its jaw snap as it unhinged and felt a blast of disgusting heat strike me. With delicate movements, clearly developed by past experiences, likely experiences that involved other unfortunate people, the gigantic snake pushed my head inside its jaws using its coils like I would my hands, past its thin, pointed teeth, and then moved its jaws behind my head. I can still feel the pinch and pull of its teeth along my body today, as clearly as I did then. It was painful. The snake began pushing me into its deep throat. It was slow. Dear God, it was so slow. The snake paused after every swallow, and I couldn't fight back at all. The coils, the teeth, and the snake's body held my arms and legs tightly. All I could do was lay there and let that horrible thing, happen. It was frightening and maddening. I hope that no one else ever experiences that kind of paralyzing fear, that maddening fear. Despite the deliberately slow actions of the Titanoboa, all too soon I was completely inside its body. I was able to hear the muffled sound of its jaw rehinging as I slowly continued to move down into its body to the place of no return. Obviously, this snake had been able to talk, but it didn't seem to want anything from me but to get a fresh meal. I passed out before I got to the snake's stomach, and, before everything went black, I really thought that was the end of me. But since I'm writing this now, I didn't die. I awoke, after what had to be only a few minutes, to a violent shaking as the snake was thrashed about. Suddenly, something sharp tore through the snake's flesh next to my head, almost cutting me open in the process. Then, something seized me and pulled me out of the snake's gut. As I was lifted out of the carnivore's stomach and into the fresh air, my eyes locked on Spino's eyes. I noticed right away that he seemed frightened. It was such an unusual sight to see in his gaze that I instantly took note of it. He lifted me higher into the air. I noticed his arms were shaking as well, and relief began to spread across his face. When he spoke, his statement was straight to the point. It was heading for the woods, he told me, referring to the now disemboweled Titanoboa at his feet, as he hugged me tightly to his chest. He didn't say anything else. He just hugged me. After a moment, I returned the hug. I was extremely happy to be alive. Thank you, I told Spino. My body was shaking, but I was able to keep my voice steady as I spoke. I eventually noticed that the sun was rising. This meant the snake had waited most of the night before it made its move, and the early dawn light filled the woods with glorious colors of shades of pink and orange. I have never seen a more beautiful sunrise since. How did it get in? I asked Spino once I had stopped shaking from fright, though I was then shaking from the cold. Even though I'd calmed down, part of me had hoped Spino would never let me out of his embrace. Ever. The snake found a way to open the door, Spino told me, his breath visible in the chilly air. That news was terrific to learn. If these talking creatures could figure out how to open doors, then I knew there would inevitably be more problems in the future. That was when it first became obvious to me that Spino, and the Rex that saved me, were not just flukes in this world. There had to be others. How widespread would this phenomena of talking intelligent creatures be compared to the rest of the country? That thought kept me up at night for a while. I'll end this section with a closing mystery, which occurred to me because of something the snake's words suggested to me. Winter had been set in for months, and snow and ice were in abundance. I don't understand how the Titanoboa survived in such a cold environment. My only guess is that, since the snake was one of the rare talking creatures, then it was obviously not an average Titanoboa, and it likely had other hidden secrets up its scales. The same principle goes for Spino, since he has no eel-like tail, which Spinosaurus were known to possess, and can speak, which meant he must be different in more ways than it initially seems compared to other Spinosaurus, like the ones I had seen in internet videos from places such as the Everglades. The Spinosaurus from those videos did have that eel-like tail, and out of all of them that I'd seen in videos, not one had the ability to speak. To be continued. Next video will be the conclusion of Nick's journal and the conclusion of the opening section of my original novel, The Spinosaurus. The final edit is being worked on, the cover is soon going to be made, and I'm very excited to finally share the complete work with you all. I was gonna make this section of the book one big video, but I also know people don't always have 2 to 3 hours on hand to listen to something, so I decided to make it 2 more bite-sized chunks for you. Stay tuned for part 2 in the next week or so, and the entire novel hopefully not too much longer after that. Which is so surreal because I started writing the earliest version of this story in 2018, and here we are at the end of 2024. And it's about to finally see the true light at the end of the tunnel. If you enjoyed, please check out more written works of mine on screen now, and thank you for listening. Thank you so much. And check back for part 2 very soon.